"I want to stop the killing." That sentence has been constantly repeated by Donald Trump as his motive for ending the Ukraine war. He just wants to save lives, he says. And who could argue against it? In war, truth is always the first victim, but one truth is indisputable. Putin started the war, and Putin is the sole reason it continues. After more than 3 years of failing to take Ukraine, and after close to 1 million Russians had been killed or wounded on the battlefield, Putin could pull out of Ukraine and the war would end. But Putin continues. So it's no surprise the Trump administration has spent most of their time negotiating with the Russians. To stop the war, they need Putin to stop. But what is surprising is how quickly Trump has conceded to Putin's demands. Putin wants the popular Ukrainian President Zelenskyy out of office, so Trump has called for elections in Ukraine. Putin doesn't want Ukraine joining NATO, so Trump has denied Ukraine a NATO membership. And Putin wants the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, so Trump has offered to recognize Crimea as Russian. On and on, Trump has been cowering to Putin, with nothing in return. But why is that? Why, after decades of the US siding with Ukraine, is the new US president now siding with Russia? Is Trump really trying to stop the killing? Or is he in fact selling Ukraine's freedom for his own personal gains? Let's take a closer look. In this episode, I will talk about why Trump is helping Putin. But to get to that, we will begin with the how. Trump claimed he could end the Ukraine war in just 24 hours, but ending a war is a complex matter, because wars often have many stakeholders with conflicting interests. It makes the process simpler if one side has lost the war and no longer has any say in the peace process. In World War I, for instance, Germany was forced to surrender and signed the Versailles Treaty, a peace treaty dictated by the Allies without German participation. But even in that situation, it still took 6 months for the Allies to formulate their demands. In the case of the Ukraine war, peace is complicated by the fact that no party has lost the war. This means on each side a peace compromise is still competing with the prospect of winning the war. And politically, as long as there's a chance of winning, compromise is a very hard sell. In Russia, compromising is almost unthinkable because the entire Russian propaganda apparatus has spent over 3 years convincing the Russians that Russia is invincible and Putin's war is necessary. While in Ukraine, compromising feels unfair because Ukraine didn't start the war, and the Russians have now plundered, raped, and destroyed their way through Ukraine for more than 3 years. Then there is the actual treaty itself. How would Trump even define a compromise which both sides would find acceptable? Depending on the exact wording of a peace treaty, it could have very different consequences for both Ukraine and Russia. To examine this, let me just give you 3 examples of what is at stake. First, there is the geographic outcome of the peace treaty, which I will illustrate with this spectrum reaching all the way from full liberation of Ukraine to Russia annexing all of the country. Putin attacked Ukraine to expand his Russian empire, and when the war began, he was all the way over here, expecting to conquer all of Ukraine. You would think that after years of failing to achieve this goal, Putin might realize he can never take Ukraine. But at least officially, he's still telling his people that Ukraine belongs to Russia. In a recent interview, Putin said Russia has enough strength to complete the objectives of the operation, and he even described Ukrainians as the Ukrainian part of the Russian people. So Putin is still located all the way to the right. In Ukraine, the picture is more nuanced. Ukrainian politicians emphasize Ukraine's right to keep its internationally recognized borders, which has been supported by 100 UN member countries who voted in favor of UN Resolution 68262 right after Putin attacked Crimea in 2014. But the war is understandably taking a toll on the Ukrainian people. While most Ukrainians still say they will not give up land for peace, the willingness to do so has grown throughout 2024, with 39% now in favor. This right there is the reason Putin is committing war crime after war crime, bombing civilians in Ukraine. He is hoping to exhaust the Ukrainian morale. But at least for now, Ukraine's official position is still full liberation, placing President Zelenskyy all the way to the left. Trump believes that a compromise just means freezing the front lines where they are. The consequence being, Russia would still occupy the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea and most of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And Trump has even offered Putin to officially recognize Crimea as Russian. This places him at Putin's end of the spectrum, although officially not all the way towards full annexation. However, Ukraine's allies strongly disagree. On April 24, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is non-negotiable. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has taken the same position as have many other allies. Then there is the economic outcome. At one end of the spectrum, a peace treaty could help Ukraine by forcing Russia to pay reparations to rebuild what Putin has destroyed, perhaps by transferring all of the seized Russian assets into a Ukrainian reconstruction fund. At the other end of the spectrum, a peace treaty could help Vladimir Putin by removing all Russian sanctions. And of course, a peace treaty could be a mix of these options. This spectrum is important because in February, a new study revealed that the destruction in Ukraine now amounts to a mind-boggling $524 billion. From Putin's perspective, if he conquers Ukraine, he can leave it to the Ukrainians to clean up his mess. And with his economy under immense pressure, he's also highly dependent on lifting the Russian sanctions to get his economy back on track. This is what places him all the way to the right. But the Russians have bombed 2.5 million households in Ukraine and destroyed much of their infrastructure. So of course, from Ukraine's perspective, Russia should now pay reparations. And keeping the Russian sanctions is crucial to prevent Putin from funding his war machine. This places President Zelenskyy all the way to the left. And the Ukraine allies agree. In fact, they are now increasing their sanctions on Russia while helping Ukraine financially. But at the other end of the spectrum, Trump is very much on Putin's side, never demanding reparations for what Putin has destroyed. It was overlooked by most of the world press, but in April, Trump even lifted the sanctions on Karina Rotenberg, which is an astounding testament to Trump's allegiance. Karina Rotenberg is wife of Russian oligarch Boris Rotenberg, a childhood friend of none other than Vladimir Putin. And when Trump put tariffs on virtually all countries on the planet, including Ukraine, the new tariffs on Russia were nowhere to be found. Instead, Trump posted on Truth Social that Russia can make a fortune by doing big business with the United States. This is what places Trump right next to Vladimir Putin. Finally, there is the security outcome of the peace treaty, reaching from a full NATO membership for Ukraine to no security guarantees at all. Again and again, Putin has said that protecting Ukraine with foreign forces would be seen as a threat. This places Putin all the way to the right, where Ukraine has no guarantees against further Russian aggression. Ukraine, on the other hand, has no reason to stop the fighting unless they have a guarantee that this is not just a temporary pause where Putin can replenish his forces before continuing the war. This places Zelenskyy all the way to the left, ideally wanting a NATO membership or at least some form of security guarantees from his allies. And Zelenskyy is not alone. Again and again, both the EU, the UK, and many other allies have backed Ukraine's demands. Because after Putin's wars in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, and now Ukraine, everyone has realized Putin's appetite for war is insatiable. But that does not resonate with Donald Trump. He has completely ruled out Ukrainian NATO membership, and he does not want to provide any tangible security guarantees, exactly like Putin wants it. The strangest thing about this graphic is, only a few months ago this picture was completely different. The US under Biden supported the fight for Ukraine's freedom. The US seized Russian assets and sanctioned Russia hard. And while Biden did not offer Ukraine a NATO membership, he wanted to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, until Putin was defeated. Our alliance was strong and Putin was isolated, but sadly, along came Trump. This brings us to the question, why? Why is the US under Trump suddenly siding with Russia? There are many theories, but let me just mention a few of the most prominent. First, there is the puppet theory, the idea that Trump is somehow fully controlled by Vladimir Putin. Here, Trump is sometimes called an agent to suggest that Trump is a professional Russian spy. Other times, he's called an asset to suggest more loosely that Trump is a Russian collaborator of sorts. This theory became famous in the 2016 US presidential election, where Hillary Clinton described Trump as Putin's puppet.
Look, Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
It's pretty clear you won't admit.
More recently, the puppet theory has been fueled by former KGB agent Alnur Mussayev, a Soviet defector now living in Austria. He has claimed that Trump was recruited by the KGB in 1987 and given the codename Krasnov. But there are two problems with this claim. The first is, whenever the FBI captures a Russian spy, the only reason the spy has been able to operate in the US for some time without detection is because of their secrecy, their professionalism, and their preference for anonymity. Trump, on the other hand, is a flamboyant charlatan who loves the spotlight and will brag openly about everything he does. Not exactly the profile of someone with KGB recruitment potential. The second problem is this puppet theory was examined thoroughly by none other than former FBI Director Robert Mueller in 2019, when he investigated Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Mueller and his team did prove that Russia tried to influence the US election, but importantly, they did not prove that Trump actively conspired with the Russians. And that is an important distinction. There are several reasons why Russia could favor Trump as president, without that automatically meaning Trump is directly working for Russia. I'm fully aware that a lot of people still think that Trump is a Russian agent and Mueller just didn't find the proof. But let me ask you, if you really believe a disorganized person like Trump would be able to hide his collusion with Russia for 38 years, as Alnur Mussayev claims, could he be a Russian agent inside the United States? A man so careless he keeps top-secret documents containing US war plans in cardboard boxes in his bathroom. I find that hard to believe. Then there's the so-called compromat theory, named after the Russian word for compromising material. This theory suggests that Trump is working for Putin not of his own free will, but because Putin has damaging information about Trump that he could otherwise release to the public. This theory has made endless rounds on social media, mainly because of the so-called Steele dossier, released in 2017 by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele. This document contained many colorful but unsubstantiated rumors about Trump, including the idea that Putin had salacious video recordings of Trump in certain activities involving a number of women. But do we really believe that Trump would go through his life a slave to Vladimir Putin because Putin would otherwise share an embarrassing video? We're talking about a US president who got elected by his voters after it became publicly known he had a sexual relationship with both a porn star and a Playboy model, while married to Melania Trump. A president elected after being convicted of federal crimes even. I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin has compromised on many influential people and likely also on Trump. But it's a long stretch to say that the threat of releasing a salacious video is highly effective against someone who has no moral high ground. I prefer a third theory, which is based on what we know. We know that Trump and Putin have a lot in common. They're both right-wing populists, opportunists so shameless they even pretend to be religious to cater to religious voters. So unscrupulous they both persecute minorities to drum up support from extremists. And they both aim for a world run by the rich, where ordinary people have no say. A world where they are untouchable, out of reach of even the highest courts. It is in this world we find what I call the shared interests theory. Trump makes decisions that help Putin, and Putin makes decisions that help Trump, not because they have a formal collaboration, but because it's in their own interest to do so. Think about it. Biden despised Vladimir Putin and spent much of his time pursuing Putin's defeat in Ukraine, while Trump is an isolationist who keeps complaining that helping Ukraine is way too expensive. To Trump, it is only natural that the US takes over neighboring countries like Canada and Greenland, because might is always right. And in Trump's eyes, Putin taking over Ukraine is no different. Clearly, Trump's worldview in itself could be a strong reason for Putin to influence the US election and try to get Trump elected. And countless times Trump has talked about how brilliant he thinks Putin is. He idolizes Putin because Putin has succeeded in transforming a democratic republic into a mafia state, an autocracy where Putin is an untouchable dictator and anyone who stands in his way either falls out of a window or withers away in a prison colony. Putin is living Trump's dream in vast palaces of shimmering gold. This is the reason why Trump keeps pushing our world towards autocracy and aiding Putin on the way. So is Trump really trying to stop the killing? Or is he in fact selling Ukraine's freedom for his own personal gains? A strong indicator is Trump has actually paused the military aid and the sharing of intelligence with Ukraine multiple times. Decisions that very likely have prolonged the war and increased the loss of life. All of Ukraine's allies see Putin's war in Ukraine as a historic inflection point. An event that has the potential to restart a world of wars or end the violence forever by setting an example with Putin's crushing defeat. This too was the official position of the United States right until Trump's inauguration. When Trump offers to recognize Crimea as Russian, it is because he doesn't care what happens to the 2.5 million people living in Crimea who used to live in Ukraine's democracy. When he calls for elections in Ukraine in the middle of a war, it's because he doesn't care if Putin could influence such an election and the Ukrainians could lose their popular leader. And when Trump denies Ukraine any security guarantees, it's because he doesn't care if the Russian war machine destroys all of Ukraine. Trump just wants to end the support for Ukraine and save those billions and billions of dollars he always talks about. Money which could become tax cuts for his own personal oligarchy friends. But Trump's problem is he's very much alone. He may have surrounded himself with yes-men, but in Congress a rebellion against Trump is brewing. And poll after poll shows that the American people is on Ukraine's side. So Trump hasn't yet dared to leave Ukraine to be run over by Russia. Instead, Trump has resorted to an old trick, which liars often use. A trick that philosopher Nicholas Shackle has called the modern Bailey fallacy. If you have an unpopular opinion that could be really hard to defend, you just pretend to have a more popular point of view that's easier to defend, but ultimately achieves the same goal. Right this moment, if Trump said, "I do not care if Putin takes all of Ukraine," that would create a strong counter-reaction in the United States. But camouflaging his intention of abandoning Ukraine by saying, "I just want to stop the killing," establishes the fallacy that Trump is trying to protect the Ukrainian people. And if you're against what Trump is doing, you must be pro-killing. It's a neat trick that works very much like the Mott and Bailey castles of the medieval era, hence the name Mott and Bailey fallacy. These primitive castles have a bailey, which is a large area you really want to own and defend. But since such a large area is expensive to fortify and therefore difficult to defend, you spend most of your resources on creating an impregnable strong tower on a hill that no one dares to attack. That is what Trump is doing. What he really wants, his Bailey, is to pull the plug on Ukraine and get some profitable trade going with Russia. But US politics would explode if he said that out loud. So instead, he builds a mud, the impregnable position that he just wants to stop the killing. A moral high ground that no one dares to attack. But we should attack this position because, as everything else Trump is saying, it is a deceitful lie. Trump is not a friend of the Ukrainian people, and Trump doesn't want to stop the killing. Like Charon, the ferryman in Greek mythology, Trump doesn't care how many people he ferries across the river to the land of the dead, as long as he earns a coin on the way.